Now, I had started working on this message before I had found out that our beloved brother Charlie had passed away. And I was amazed because the topic that God had laid on my heart was grief. And I don't think that was a mistake because, well, God doesn't make mistakes. And it just instantly reminded me of all the times Charlie would be sitting in the back and I'd be sitting either in the sound booth or with the youth kids. And when my dad would preach, he would just sit in the back shaking his head because it would go right along with what he had for Sunday school. Not knowing what my dad was going to preach and my dad not knowing what he was going to teach in Sunday school.
I saw that a lot.
God lines things up for such a time as this. I remember when I was first starting out as a youth pastor, I think it was one of my earlier youth groups where they kept me on my toes because they would have questions on everything. And these questions sometimes would be ones I didn't even think of. And I would try my best to answer every question to the best of my ability and within the limited time frame of a Wednesday night service or a Sunday school service. And while that is good, there are times where God wants us to take more time, to flesh things out more, to listen to His Spirit. And instead of thinking we're doing good spiritual things, that when we hear that pause, we need to take more time on this to listen. Because I remember one such time that afterwards, I didn't see one of the youth group members for months. And then I ran into that youth group member's parent, and they told me that they were upset with me. I'm like, what did I do? I haven't seen this person in months. And they told me that their child was so distraught by what I had talked about in youth group because how I had phrased things and didn't expand upon what I was trying to say. They thought, because we were talking about grief at the time, that when I had mentioned that it is important to not get consumed by emotions, that I was saying that we shouldn't feel them, that grief is ungodly. Now, why those thoughts never entered my mind whatsoever, and I have never ever believed that. I remember as soon as the parent said something, that even though I didn't know what was going on in this youth's mind, I remember in that lesson that I kept hearing God's voice in the back of my head telling me to slow down. But I knew we were running out of time, so I went faster. I did what I thought was right in the moment and didn't stop and listen. And thankfully, I was able to straighten out exactly what I had said and what I had meant. And I remember the parents saying, well, why did this, my kid think that? I'm like, because kids are individuals. They have their own perspective. And I should have gone slower. Because kids don't always, when they have a question, will ask for clarification. And you know what? It's not just kids, it's not just youth. We adults sometimes will take things at face value and not do any more digging. Grief is a natural part of life. Grief is a godly emotion to work through. Jesus himself grieved. In John chapter 11, starting in verse 1, it says, a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But his disciples objected. "Rabbi," they said, "only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going to go there again?" Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought that Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go too," and died with Jesus. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Mary and Martha in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," Martha said, "he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I have always believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him?" But some said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here so that they will believe you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Now, there are 2 really important things here. Jesus wept. He showed grief and sadness. Now, one thing that we hear all the time in the Christian community, that when someone dies that I can only say assume, because we never really know. No one knows the heart of man but God. We can know them by their fruits. We can say, it's not a time to mourn, it's a time to rejoice, for we will see them again. And while that is 100% true, if a person has Christ in their heart, you have Christ in their heart, you're going to see them again. That doesn't mean that grief still isn't there. Especially if you know someone is sick if you know someone has a terminal illness, just because you know that they're going to die sooner rather than later does not mean that you're not going to be grieved when it does happen. Jesus wept. He knew that Lazarus was going to die. He knew that Lazarus was dead. But that did not change his love. That did not mean that he was not sad seeing the people that loved him, the people that he loved, also being sad. Because we do not serve an emotionless God. We do not serve a callous God. We serve a God of mercy and of love and compassion. But then there's a second thing to look at in this, and that Jesus was angry. It said that 2 times in John 11, verses 1 through 44, that Jesus was angry. Jesus was angry because this is not the kind of life that we were created to live. Jesus did not create us to suffer. Because of the fall of man and the wiles of the enemy, suffering of God's creation is rampant. As you can hear the suffering of my child in her pack and play right now. Jesus was angry.
Angry as a child in a pack and play.
When God looks down, even though he knew that the war in Ukraine was going to happen, he knew that the talks weren't going to go well, it just happened. He knew that we were going to lose Brother Charlie. He knew that we were going to maybe lose a job, lose a relationship, whether it be a friendship or something like that. God knew about all these losses, but that doesn't mean that his compassion for us is non-existent. That doesn't mean that he does not weep with us, that he does not experience anger and all these other things, but he sins not, for he is God. And with God in our hearts, we have the ability to not pretend that our grief and our anger at things are not there, but to work with him, to work through them. The home of Paul Laurence Dunbar, noted poet, is open to the public in Dayton, Ohio. When he died, his mother left his room exactly as it was on the day of his death. At the desk of this brilliant man was his final poem, handwritten on a pad. After his mother died, her friends discovered that Paul Laurence Dunbar's last poem was lost forever. Because his mother had made his room into a shrine and not moved anything, the sun had bleached the ink on which the poem was written until it was invisible. The poem was gone. If we stay in mourning, we lose so much of life. And I don't just mean mourning when someone we love passes. Grief is so much more than just in relation to death. We grieve friendships. We grieve different phases of life. I'm not a huge country fan, but I think of that one country song that says, you're going to miss this, you're going to want this back. And each verse talks about different phases of life. How, like, when you're a kid, all you want to do is grow up, and then you grow up and, like, what was I thinking? There were no bills. Like, I will take nap time anytime. You know, when we get older and we have different ailments or injuries, I mean, I know that I'm still young. I'm only 35 years old, but through different accidents and through a very harsh pregnancy and labor, my 35-year-old body is significantly weaker and more injured than my 20-year-old body. And I grieve the loss of that every day, to the point where I've gotten angry, where God has had to help me work through it. To help me, instead of getting mad at myself and being so consumed with, well, I can't do this, that, or the other anymore. I used to be able to do all this in one day. I used to be able to do this by myself. I don't like asking for help. to where God is like, start thinking outside the box, start asking for help. But if we stay in grief and anger and mourning, these things, these emotions, if we don't work through them, if we ignore them, if we try and shove them down, we miss the good things about the next phase of life. Grief is important. Jesus knew about Lazarus' death and he still wept. It's because we serve a risen Savior whose heart was so big that he sacrificed himself so that we all might be saved. Jesus went through all of that. Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. He knew what was waiting for him. The torture, not just the death on the cross and the mocking and people that he loved pretending that they didn't know him, but the torture, the beating, the crown of thorns, everything. He knew all that. And he also knew how people would use his name in vain, would mock him, would torture the people that did love and follow him. He knew that not all would be saved, but for the ones that might be saved and would accept him was worth it, because he loves all of us, whether we accept him or not, that much. Whether we follow him or not, he loves us that much. Leslie Postel, the editor of griefandsympathy.com, wrote about the hidden benefits of grief if done so healthily. Some of these benefits include the acceptance of things I can't change. And I know that sounds so cliche, but something I've learned, if you really can accept, I can't change this, you can finally move forward and find strength that you had no idea you had. To find a different way to do things that you didn't know existed. That you can find new interests, new things that God will have you to do. Because just because God called you to do one thing and then something happens and you can't do it anymore, whether physically or whatever, that doesn't mean that your calling is done. It means it's time for the next phase of your life. I know when my mom was alive, she loved to go and visit shut-ins of the church and to visit them and bring them food and companionship. And when that got to be too much, she started a card ministry and just sending everybody cards when it was their birthday, sympathy. She sent Mother's Day and Father's Day cards to people who had lost their moms and dads, letting them know that she was thinking of them and praying for them. Like, she really thought outside the box. We need to start relying on God to get us through. Because every time we see a brick wall and a dead end, God is standing right there with you, open arms, like, no, look over here. This is new. This is wonderful. It's not what you're used to, but this is going to be great. Look this way. And we stubbornly don't.
But brick wall.
Number 2, appreciation of my loved one who's gone. Appreciation for my own life. To make the most of every day. A new understanding of my loved one's place in my life. A new understanding of my place in life. Maturity, responsibility, a clear understanding of others. Confidence that with Christ I can cope with anything life throws at me. What's important in life? Not to worry about the trivial, because sometimes, as my mom used to say, we make a mountain out of a molehill. Things that seem so big to us really aren't. And if we can ask God for clarity to help us deal with these feelings of sadness and grief and anger and hurt and confusion, and like things are just over, God will bring anew. Help us to treasure moments of happiness, to love those that are around you as they are, to be grateful for every day, to treasure precious memories, and to ensure that you make new and special memories. And I know she was talking specifically about loved ones and that kind of grief, but that can apply to any kind of grief. Again, I can only speak to my own experience, but I have spent so long grieving that I can't rearrange and clean the church and then go back and do it home all in one day by mostly myself because of the injuries that I have and the things that are going on. But God has been showing me that I can spend all day long beating myself up about the things that I can't do anymore, about how things are never going to be quite as clean as I want them to when it's just me. Or I could stop wasting time, accept that this is what my body can do, and celebrate, oh, I was able to do a whole entire thing of dishes by myself with no help. Yes, I have to sit down, but I accomplished something. And instead of being mad at myself, using that time to create special memories by sitting down and reading with my child. To sit down and call someone that I haven't talked to in a while to encourage them. To make new memories. We need to stop wasting time. If there are relationships that we have lost for one reason or another, it's difficult. And I've been there too, where you just miss that person so much. But if that person won't talk to you for whatever reason, there's nothing you can do to change that. So all you can do is still love them and pray for them. But try and create new memories with the people that you do have. Don't let the hurts of the past stop you from establishing a relationship with someone new, because God might be trying to heal your hurts with a brand new friendship that will become closer than a brother or a sister, but we're missing out on it because we're mourning the past. When grief threatens to consume us, because I can tell you, grief demands to be felt. You can try all you want to ignore it, but grief is difficult. If it has to do with losing a loved one, to this day, my grandmother passed away on March 23rd, 2012. So it'll be 10 years this year. 10 years. And every time something exciting or bad happens, I still go to call her. And then remember that she's not there to talk to. Grief demands to be felt. There are times where my mind and my spirit are willing to let's clean this and rearrange that. And then my back and my knees that are damaged are like, we cannot do that anymore. And I get angry. And I know it's a different situation for everyone, but again, I can only speak on myself. Grief and anger and sadness demand to be felt, especially when you try to ignore it like it's not there. But when that happens, we can rely on Psalms 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. If you're crushed for missing someone, whether it be by death or the relationship ended for whatever reason, whether it be familial, friendship, or romantic, whether you're brokenhearted because your body can't do what you want it to do, whether you're brokenhearted because you can put food in your family's stomach and have a roof over the head, but you can't even go camping or something like that. Whatever is causing you to be brokenhearted, God cares. God rescues those whose spirits are crushed. While other people might look at your brokenheartedness and your grief as something like, oh, that's nothing. Let me tell you something. Everybody has that proverbial plate. And some of us might have a really big plate that's always full and overflowing. And just because the person next to you has a smaller plate than you doesn't make it any less full and hard for them to handle. Do you hear what I'm trying to say?
Just because to you it doesn't seem so bad doesn't mean that's not like one of the worst hurts that person has ever experienced.
Exactly. So we need to be kind and remember that God rescues those who are crushed. We can rely on Matthew 5:4. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That even though I heard someone say that grief is like being in a square room with this big ball of pain and sadness, and that as time goes on, sometimes that ball shrinks and it's easier to deal with, and other times it grows bigger and harder to deal with. But we can know that no matter where we are in the grieving process, we will be comforted by the Lord. And we can even rely on John 11:35, Jesus wept, to remind us that we do not serve a God who thinks like we do. We do not serve a God who compares us to one another, saying, well, brother and sister so-and-so has been through infinitely more than you have, and look how they're dealing with it. I remember growing up, my church was also my school, and I hated it because everyone knew everybody's business, and the thing I heard the most from parents were, well, Kristen makes, really good grades and never gets in trouble, and look at what she goes through at home. That did not gain me any friends, let me tell you that. God doesn't act like that. God doesn't say things like that. He doesn't even think things like that. He looks at you as an individual. He loves you through it all. Your hurt is his hurt. He hurts when you hurt. He weeps when you weep. And he will help you through it. Because we serve a God of love and mercy who wants us to live life abundantly and not stuck. Not slamming our head up against a brick wall.